All right, we're going to get started. I'm Sam Gershman. I'm Lucy's advisor. And let me just make a quick logistical note. So I'm going to say a few words of introduction. Lucy's going to give her public seminar. There's going to be a chance for everyone to ask questions, and then we're going to ask everyone to leave for a little bit while the committee deliberates, and then we'll go out and finish. Okay? Oh yeah, and one other thing, which is that all of you are invited over to my lab space in the Northwest building around 5. We'll have a little reception. All right. I'm a little bit in shock that this day has arrived because I'll admit that I have become so used to Lucy being in my lab, being an integral part of my lab, that I was secretly hoping she'd be a grad student forever. But here we are. And let me just say a few words about Lucy, the scientist, and Lucy, the person. So in my view, Lucy has become really the complete scientist in the sense that she understands how to do computational theory, analysis of behavior in humans and non-human animals, working with psychiatric data and neural data. And what she's going to talk about is really a beautiful tapestry weaving together all of that, all of those skills and knowledge. And I'm going to let her tell you about that. I'll just mention now that it was not easy getting to that point. I think for a lot of the grad students in the room that will recognize this syndrome where, for the first 4 years of your PhD, nothing is working and it's extremely frustrating. And then, in the last few years of your PhD, when things really started to click, the chronic illness that she was managing so well for so many years sort of became finally less manageable. And I'll admit that, it became bad enough that I almost pulled the plug on this defense because I was worried it was jeopardizing her health. But she was really committed to following through on it, and she did. Here she is now. And I think that, that those kinds of struggles might have broken a lesser person. And this is where we get to Lucy, the person. I think Lucy has just really extraordinary personal assets in her strength of character and joy in life, right? And I think that's really what makes her unsinkable. And all the people in the lab, whenever she's around, we kind of pull energy from that and makes us less sinkable. And so I really appreciated that all the time that I've known Lucy. And then the last thing I'll say is something that many of you know, which is that Lucy is very wise. And I'm not in the habit of taking counsel from my grad students, but there have been a few times where Lucy gave me some important advice when I really needed it, and I was very grateful for that as well. And I would say also that UC San Diego recognized that wisdom when they offered her a faculty position, a year before she'd even finished her PhD. And so now they get to benefit from the unsinkable Lucy. And so without further ado, I want to turn it over to Lucy for her defense.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was very generous. And yeah, I'll try to not get emotional until the end. So thank you guys all for being here today in person and on Zoom. It really means a lot to me. And so today I'll be sharing with you what I've been working on over the course of my PhD. In the last few years, I've been developing and testing this theory called policy compression, which attempts to explain why and how people act with limited cognitive resources. So imagine you're hosting a dinner party for some of your friends. You need to decide what to make for dinner, and in doing so, you recall that some of them have strong food preferences or certain dietary restrictions. So here, you have to make a decision. Do you try to make everyone their favorite food, or do you make the same dish for everyone? Inherently, making any decision requires you to weigh the costs against the benefits of each option. Is it worth the effort to make everyone happy by making their own favorite dish? What if on the day of the party you're tired and you don't have the mental energy to remember who likes to eat what? In that case, it might just be easier to prepare the same dish for everyone, even though you might sacrifice their overall enjoyment of the dinner. So as I've just illustrated, all decisions require mental effort, which can include things like learning what everyone's favorite dish is, remembering that information, and then planning out the dinner. And because as humans, we don't have unlimited mental capacity, our decisions will be shaped by constraints on our cognitive resources. This leads to a trade-off between the value of our choices, which in our example is how happy everyone is at the end of dinner, and the cognitive effort used to make a choice. So the higher the cognitive effort used, the higher the overall value of that choice. Now, there have been plenty of studies looking at how people decide how much cognitive effort to allocate for decision-making, but a lot of this work has been focused on planning costs, or how long it takes to think through the consequences of a choice. What hasn't been studied as much is the cognitive cost of storing information in memory. Oops. I'm gonna find my laser. The cognitive cost of storing information in memory. So in this example, this would correspond to the effort involved in remembering what everyone's favorite dish is. So it takes up more space in memory to remember that information versus simply remembering that you're going to cook one dish. Specifically, I was curious about how people make decisions when their memory resources are limited. And this became the overarching question of my PhD. I tackled this big question in three main ways. First, I developed a theory to answer the question, how does a limit on memory resources affect decision-making? Then, I tested the predictions of the theory in human behavior. In one study, I asked, how are people's choices shaped by limited memory resources? In another study, I asked, how do people exploit structure in their environment to save their cognitive resources? And finally, I collaborated with another neuroscience lab at Harvard to understand how the brain supports behavior that's both efficient and flexible with limited cognitive resources. Now, because our time is limited, I'll just tell you about these three studies today. So let's begin. How does a limit on memory resources affect decision-making? To answer this question, we have to first define what we mean by memory and what we mean by decision-making. Now, this is where computational modeling becomes useful because we can use math to define these terms and measure them quantitatively. We can model decision-making using a framework called reinforcement learning, which is a subfield of computer science that describes how agents learn from interactions with their environment. This makes it a useful tool because we as humans also learn in this way. So in reinforcement learning models, you have a couple of important ingredients. You have an agent that takes actions in response to a state of the environment. And the agent receives positive or negative feedback, which we call reward. The agent's goal is to maximize the overall amount of reward that it receives. Now, an agent selects actions by following its policy, which is the probability of selecting actions A in state S. You can think of the policy as instructions that tell you what to do in each state. For example, you can think of the states as your different friends and the actions as the different dishes you could cook for them. And the probability represents how likely you would cook that dish for that friend. So for my friend Maya over here, I'd be very likely to cook her curry. Now, if you do this for each friend, you can create an entire table that describes how likely you would cook each particular dish for each particular friend. This is what we call the policy. Now, like I said, agents want to learn policies that maximize overall reward. So this would be like making everyone happy by making their favorite dish. But like I illustrated in the beginning, people aren't always able to maximize reward or value because of limits on their cognitive resources. This is the whole point of the field of resource rationality, which suggests that while humans are not optimal at maximizing reward, they do the best they can with the limited cognitive resources that they have. But how do we quantify cognitive resources, or specifically memory resources? Now, this is where information theory becomes useful, because it allows us to quantify the information being communicated from a source to a destination. But how is this relevant to policies? Because another way to think about policies is that they communicate information about states to guide action selection. So the more information about state being communicated, the more memory required. Information theory allows us to quantify the amount of memory used for decision-making as the mutual information between states and actions. From now on, we're going to call this the policy complexity. So just one more time, policy complexity, or mutual information, is the measure of memory resources used for decision-making. To make this a little bit more intuitive, let's contrast this policy with another one where you make everybody the same dish. Now, the policy on the right requires you to remember who you're serving what dish, while for the policy on the left, you don't need to remember who you're serving because you're serving them all the same thing. This highlights how a high complexity policy is inherently more demanding on memory resources compared to a low complexity policy. Another way to think about policy complexity is how much your actions depend on the state. So again, the high complexity policy requires you to match each action to a particular state, while the low complexity policy does not. Now that we've defined all the relevant terms, we can finally answer this question by solving this optimization problem of learning a policy that maximizes reward with limited memory resources. And the solution is an optimal policy that describes how people act under these circumstances. Now, before this equation scares you, I'm going to provide a translation. So what this equation is saying is that in state S, choose an action A by striking a balance between the most rewarding action in the state and repeating an action that you tend to choose frequently. So in other words, information from the state combined with your history of actions will determine the decision that you make. To provide more intuition for the model, I want to highlight that this equation is made up of two components, a state-dependent term and a state-independent term, which indexes the actions you've chosen most frequently. This parameter beta represents the amount of memory resources used and determines the balance between the two terms. Increasing the memory resources that you use will increase how state-dependent your policy is. To make this more concrete, imagine that you're deciding what dish to make for Adam. You know that for Adam, steak would make him most happy. But let's say you've been making a lot of curry recently, and that's become your go-to meal. So the dish you'll end up cooking for Adam will depend heavily on the amount of memory that you invest in remembering the fact that he likes steak. The more you remember about Adam, which is the state, the more your resulting policy will focus on the state-dependent term. The policy will be high complexity, which means you're more likely to end up making steak. The less you think about Adam when preparing the meal, the more the resulting policy will focus on the state-independent term. The policy will then be low in complexity, which means you're more likely to end up making him your go-to meal of curry. Now, like I hinted at the beginning, there's a trade-off between the amount of average reward that can be earned and the policy complexity. More complex policies will earn higher reward and by definition will also cost you more in memory resource. Now you can imagine that different people have different limits on their memory resources and can fall anywhere along this spectrum. Those limits will define the upper bound of achievable reward or the best that they could do under a certain policy complexity. Now this illustrates the concept of policy compression, which is the idea that agents will sacrifice some reward for the policy complexity to remain under the agent's resource limit. And this in turn will shape the policies that they end up learning. So that sums up the basic components of the theory that we developed. And so here are the main takeaways from the first study. First, storing policies in memory is costly. Second, this results in a trade-off between reward and policy complexity. And policies must be compressed to remain under an agent's resource limit. So how do we know that this computational model is actually an accurate description of human behavior? So in my second study, I tested this theory experimentally and asked how people's choices are shaped by limited memory resources. To do this, I designed a very simple decision-making task for people to do and observed whether their choice behavior matches the predictions of the model. So in our experiments, people are told that they're going to see a series of pictures on the screen, which correspond to the states. And they're told to press one of these three keys on the keyboard in response, and these are the actions. So here I'm just going to show you exactly what the study participants see. On each trial, people will see a single picture, and then pick a key to repress in response. And then after that, they'll either see a red or a green square around the image, indicating whether it's correct or not. Then they'll move on to the next image, make another choice, and receive feedback again. So this time it was incorrect. Now, for every correct response, the participant gets paid some amount of real money. So that's why they're incentivized to get as many trials correct as possible. So this corresponds to the goal of maximizing reward. Now, each picture, which is the state, is associated with an optimal action, which is the key that will most often give correct feedback. So in this example, K is the optimal action and will give correct feedback 80% of the time, while the other two keys will only give correct feedback 20% of the time. The study participants don't know this in advance, so even if they always press the optimal key, sometimes they'll get incorrect feedback. We do this for two reasons. First is to make the task a bit harder to learn. And second, because we can manipulate these different reward probabilities and see how people's behavior changes in response. We use this basic task to design a couple of experiments that test core predictions of the theory. The first prediction of the model was that choices should be biased by actions that are chosen more frequently. And this comes from the influence of the state-independent term in the policy, which keeps tracks of actions that you tend to choose frequently. So to test this, we designed the first task with two conditions, a control and a test condition. In the control condition, all states had different optimal actions. And in the test condition, all states also had their own optimal action, but all of the states also shared one optimal action in common. So this would be like if your friends all shared the same favorite food. So just like we have humans do this task, we can also have, Just like we have humans do this task, we can also have our model do this task and have it predict what people might do. So our model predicts that the test and the control conditions will have different reward complexity trade-offs. And this means that people can almost always earn more reward in the test condition for the same amount of effort or policy complexity. Because of this, the model predicts that people will spend slightly less cognitive resources or policy complexity in the test condition because they don't necessarily need to think about the picture on the screen to select the action. If all your friends share the same favorite food, then you don't need to think about who you're cooking for. The model also predicts that people will be able to earn more reward in the test condition. This means that the less effortful option of making everyone the same thing would make everyone happier compared to if you did a mediocre job at making everyone their own dish. So now the moment of truth. We collected data from 200 people and found that human behavior was a good match to our model's predictions. Now, of course, I want to point out that the 200 people that did this experiment are all spread out on this plot, which highlights idiosyncratic differences in people's memory resources. Policy compression makes another specific prediction, which is that people should be biased towards choosing an action that's shared among the states, even when there's another action that's equally as rewarding. So in the test condition, this means that for this yellow image, for example, people should be more likely to choose J over K, even though they give the same amount of reward. In fact, they always give reward, these two actions. This is like if one of your friends likes eating salad, but all three friends like eating curry, then you're probably going to be biased towards making just curry. Right, so you're gonna be biased towards the J instead of K. Similarly, for this green image, people should be more likely to choose J over L, even though they give the same amount of reward. And again, we see that the model successfully predicts people's choice biases. So a second prediction of the model is that choices should be biased by states that appear more frequently. Now, this is a bit harder to see from the equation, but involves the state-dependent term in the policy and the fact that people can focus more of their cognitive resources on learning what the best action is for the state that you see the most often. So to test this, we designed the second task with two conditions, again, a control and a test. And now these two conditions are exactly the same in the sense that each state has its own optimal action. But in the test condition, one of the images appears 3 times as often as the others. So this would be like if one of your friends was your roommate, and so naturally you see them more than you would the others. And again, our model predicts that the test and control conditions have different reward complexity trade-offs. And because of this, the model predicts that while people might use roughly the same amount of memory resources in both conditions, they'll earn much more reward for in the test condition where one state appears more often. This would be like if you invest the same amount of effort into cooking each friend their favorite food, but because you see your roommate more often, you get rewarded much more often for making their favorite food. Sorry about the plot. Okay, so again, we see that human behavior matches the predictions of the model. So here, policy compression predicts that people should be biased towards, towards choosing the optimal action for the state that appears most often. So since you're more likely to remember what your roommate's favorite food is, you're also more likely to make it for your other friends. This means that for the blue picture, when people make mistakes and accidentally choose one of the other two keys, their mistakes should be biased towards choosing L over K, even though both are incorrect. And this is true for the yellow image as well. People should be more likely to choose L over J, even though they're both incorrect. Right, so again, we see that choices are biased by states that appear more frequently, and this is true in behavior. The third prediction was that people's choice biases should increase under time pressure and cognitive load, 2 factors that influence and limit people's memory resources. This is akin to decreasing the value of beta, which again represents the amount of memory used. So decreasing beta increases the influence of the state-independent term, which causes the policy, again, to focus on actions that you've chosen frequently. This is probably the most intuitive prediction because when you're in a rush or there's just too many people to cook for, you're probably going to resort to making a meal that you've made a million times in the past. So when I asked people to make their choice in 1 second instead of 2, they were more biased to choose an action that they chose frequently in the past. And this choice bias also increases if you increase the cognitive load or the number of states that people have to learn and remember. So overall, our theory of policy compression was successful at explaining people's decision-making behavior. So to summarize the key takeaways, choices are biased towards frequently chosen actions. and by states that appear more frequently. And choice bias also increases under time pressure and cognitive load. Now, how does this all happen in the brain? So specifically in this third study, I wanted to understand how the brain supports behavior that's both efficient and flexible with limited cognitive resources. Now, this is important and interesting because somehow the brain can support an impressive variety of behaviors with a limited number of neurons. For this section, we're going to take our tried and true model and change the terminology slightly. And if you're interested later, I'll tell you how exactly it's different. But for now, you can trust me. So again, this equation, which we're going to call the control policy, is made up of two components. We're going to call the second component here the default policy. The more different the control policy is from your default policy, the more costly it'll be on your cognitive resources. So to give an example, imagine that you are a chef and your default signature dish to make is spaghetti and meatballs. And you made it so many times that you can make it with your eyes closed. So this is your efficient default policy. Now, making any other pasta or noodle dish might include some of the same steps, so it's still relatively easy for you. But if you had to make something completely different, like sushi, it's going to be much more effortful. But this kind of flexibility is important in the long run for you to become a better chef, right? So the intuition here is that it's cheaper for the brain to execute a default behavior, and the more different a behavior is from the default, the more expensive it is. Now we want to understand how each of these components in the model might map on to different areas of the brain. But where do we look? Well, there seems to be a good candidate within the basal ganglia, which is a group of brain structures involved in voluntary movement control and execution. In particular, we're going to focus on two substructures within the basal ganglia, the dorsolateral and dorsomedial striatum. The dorsolateral striatum, or DLS, has been shown to be responsible for efficient habitual behaviors, while the DMS is usually involved in flexibly learning and adapting to one's environment. I hypothesize that these two brain areas support efficiency and flexibility in behavior in a way that maps on to these distinct components of the model. So specifically, I thought that dorsolateral striatum might act as the default policy that stores frequently used actions or action patterns, while the dorsal medial striatum could be responsible for learning about the relationships between states and actions. So to test this model in the brain, we can train animals to learn a motor task that engages these different brain areas, and then lesion or cut out DMS or DLS before or after learning to understand the role of these brain areas in producing behavior. So to test these predictions in the brain, we teamed up with Kevin, who is a former graduate student in Ben Levesky's lab at Harvard. And their lab has developed this really unique motor learning task for the rats called the piano task. So in this task, animals learn two kinds of action sequences. The first are visually cued sequences, where on each trial, an animal will first see one of three lights light up, and then they will have to press a corresponding lever underneath each light in response. So you can think of the states as the light cues and the different levers as the actions. And just to show you what this actually looks like, here's a video. So the second task was an automatic sequence, where animals learned and memorized one sequence over and over and over again until they were essentially overtrained on it. And this is how that looks like. So they've memorized the sequence now, and that's all they do for most of their lives. All right, so we're going to use these two tasks and use our model to predict what would happen if you got rid of each of these different brain areas and how they would affect the task. So let's start with DLS. So I made this little table so we can keep track of what we learn. So again, we used our model to predict what might happen when DLS is lesioned after animals learn the task. So here's what the model predicts. Predicts that a DLS lesion should eliminate the animal's ability to perform the automatic sequence, but not the visually cued task. This is consistent with our hypothesis that DLS represents the default policy, because the animal will lose its ability to execute some well-overtrained behavior. When Kevin did the experiments, it turns out that the data actually match, or the behavior matches very well with what we have predicted here. Next, we examine DMS. So our model predicts that a DMS lesion wouldn't affect it actually predicts that it wouldn't affect the ability to perform either task, because we specifically hypothesized that DMS is important for learning about the rewarding state-action relationships, right? So if you lesion it after learning, then you're not going to affect its ability of anything that it's already learned. So this is also true in the animals. If you lesion this part of the brain after they've learned, then you actually don't affect their task performance at all, which is kind of incredible. You can just go on without part of your brain. But then what about lesioning DMS before you've learned anything? So this is where Cheshta and Kia, another graduate student and a postdoc in the Oleksky lab, came to help. They lesioned DMS before the animal had learned anything and found that DMS lesion animals struggled even to learn to press one lever in response to a cue. So this plot shows the lever pressing accuracy of these animals over hundreds of thousands of trials. And so as you can see, the controls are able to learn this task pretty quickly. They get up to a high accuracy, but then the lesion animals in red, it takes them much, much longer to do it. Even though, maybe in the end, their average accuracy might be comparable. Now, if you might imagine that if they're this impaired for the one lever task, they're even more impaired when they have to sequence 3 actions together. So again, here's the controls compared to the lesion animals. And here the lesion animals actually, in fact, give up after a couple hundred sessions because they just can't do anything different anymore. So to give you a sense of this impairment, here's a control animal, a not lesion animal, doing the task. So she's perfect. And then here's a poor lesion animal doing the task. So it's interesting, you'll note that the lesion animal will press one lever and then visit the water port immediately. And it's very hard for the animal to stop doing that. So now we've seen how these brain areas work together to balance the automatic and efficient execution of learned behaviors with the flexibility to learn new behaviors. We've only just scratched the surface in exploring the neurobiological implications of this model. But what's useful about modeling is that it can generate new predictions and questions to guide experiments that haven't yet been conducted. So for example, one prediction is that if DMS is responsible for learning, then animals shouldn't be able to learn anything new after lesions. So in the case of the piano task, the animals could still do both tasks, the automatic and the cue task, after lesion. But if they were to try to learn a new task after you lesion them, then they shouldn't be able to do it. A second question is how the brain actually encodes the cost of behavior. So again, remember I said the model predicts that the more different a behavior is from the default behavior, the more costly it should be. So it's an open question how you could find a signature of this cost in the neural activity of these different brain areas. So that leaves a lot of open questions for future work. So to sum up this third study, we showed that DLS represents cheap, efficient policies, while DMS flexibly learns new behaviors. And the brain divides the labor between DLS and DMS to balance efficiency and flexibility in complex behavior. So now that we've answered these 3 questions, what's next? I want to end with 2 things to chew on. One is a future direction, and one is an application. I'll start with the future direction. So like I said at the beginning of my talk, I focused here on a particular kind of cognitive cost, which is the information cost of storing policies in memory. But there's also other kinds of cognitive costs to consider. So going back to my original example, there's not only the cost of remembering who you're serving, but also the cost of learning what their favorite dish is in the first place, or the cost of having to plan out and then make the entire meal. So formally, these 3 types of complexity costs can be categorized into policy complexity, or how much memory is required, computational complexity, or how much thinking is required, and sample complexity, or how much learning is required. And in fact, these 3 measures are related. Specifically, computational complexity indexes the amount of time it takes to decode or execute a policy, which is why simpler or more compressible policies are executed faster. This is akin to how cooking one dish for all is faster than cooking, everyone their separate dish. A similar relationship exists between policy and sample complexity, or the amount of data required to learn a policy, which explains why simpler or more compressible policies are easier to learn. So by distinguishing these different measures of complexity, we can more accurately characterize the type of cognitive effort that's being engaged in different tasks. And by relating these measures of complexity, we can better understand how deficits in one measure influence the allocation of effort in other areas. And so one direction for future work is to examine, is to design tasks to tease apart these different measures of effort and to understand how people weigh them relative to each other. So distinguishing these measures can also inform our understanding of psychiatric disease. For example, patients with schizophrenia or Parkinson's disease, they often have some cognitive deficit, and it would be important to distinguish whether that's a deficit in time, memory, or learning in order to better characterize heterogeneous presentations of the same illness. Okay, so second is an application. So in general, if you understand humans better, then you can work with humans better. So if you recall in my second study, I found that people were biased towards choosing an action that they've chosen in the past, especially under time pressure or cognitive load. Now, the logic is this. So most people are going about their lives with high cognitive load. But if we understand how people's behavior is biased under cognitive resource constraints, then we can design choice environments that help people make better decisions in important domains. For example, consider the case of organ donation. So here's a chart of different countries with different organ donation policies. People are more likely to become organ donors when the system is designed so that people have to opt out. So this means that the default is to be automatically enrolled as an organ donor. And as you can see, we can get way more organ donations simply by considering the fact that signing up for something is effortful, and that people would rather not expend their limited cognitive resources thinking about whether they want to become an organ donor or not, or remembering to do so. A similar story applies in the domain of saving for retirement. So this plot shows that people save more money over time when the default option is to be automatically enrolled into a retirement savings plan, like a 401k. Now, saving for retirement is like a really important decision, right? But one that's often complicated or overwhelming for people to think about. But if the default is to be automatically enrolled through your employer, then people increase their participation and savings without having to really do anything. So these are just 2 examples of how understanding human decision-making could be applied to help people make better decisions. Now, the hope here is that this can be done even better with quantitative models of choice rather than simply qualitative psychological principles. And so that's something that I'm excited to explore in my future research. So with that, I want to thank all my funding sources, my entire lab, both past and present, and my collaborators from Wenzel Ovechkin's lab, who made the third study both fun and possible. And thank you all for spending your cognitive resources with me in this hour. So before we move on to questions, I hope you'll allow me a brief moment to wax poetic about the people who have shaped my PhD. So I'll start with Sam. Yeah, I really wanted to be Sam's student. I was such a fangirl, as I think a lot of people are before they meet Sam. I am still a fangirl, but yeah, I remember asking him if I could join his lab, and he told me he wasn't taking students, but I wouldn't take no for an answer, so I just came and then never left. I joined Sam because I found his mind to be very interesting. So to give an example, here's a tweet that gives you a little picture into Sam's inner mind. And I think something that I really love about Sam is that he really has exemplified that you can continue this childlike curiosity throughout your life, and you don't have to become this boring person who doesn't think interesting thoughts anymore. And doing a PhD requires a lot of that creativity and often sometimes silly, kind of thinking that gets you into really crazy ideas that nobody else wants to do because they're risk averse. So I've really appreciated how Sam has given me the freedom to pursue questions and projects that may not have worked out, but that I think have really strengthened my resilience as a person and as a scientist, and has made me believe that I can be a scientist. And that's really important in a mentor. Now, a lot of you know that I moved to Japan last year, and so a lot of what I've been seeing of Sam is over the computer. And unbeknownst to him, I've taken these cute pictures of our meetings, so it's nice memories. Next, I want to thank my dissertation advisory committee. Jan is here today. They've really helped me along in my PhD by giving me a lot of guidance and feedback on my work and encouragement as well, which is really important. And it's important to take a step back and realize the amount of privilege that it is to be here at a place like Harvard and have access to talk to people like this. And I'm just so thankful that these people are willing to give me their time and attention. Similarly, it goes for my dissertation examination committee, now Fiery and Joe, for reading my entire thesis and hopefully having some really good discussion points in the next hour. I want to take some time to thank other people who have helped raise me as a scientist. So in particular, these are 3 mentors that I had in my undergraduate years doing research at different places in the US, particularly Jeff Yao, who is now a really great friend. I joined his lab when I was 18 years old at Rice University, and he never saw my lack of knowledge as something to avoid, but rather something to invest in and mentor, and I really hope to be that person to my students someday. I want to give a special shout out to Weiji Ma at NYU, who has been this kind of unofficial mentor to me over the last few years. Even though we've never worked on any research together, he's always there if I want to talk or just, talk through decisions in life. I want to thank my advisors and collaborators at UCL during my research visit there a couple of years ago, Toby and Quentin. And also in the past year, my mentors and labs I was affiliated with at OIST, Kenji Doya and Gail Tripp. So, I didn't even get to share, but a lot of my PhD has also been defined by teaching and learning, or teaching and mentoring and learning, obviously. But this was enabled by a couple of key people. So the first is Venki Murthy, who is a professor in the molecular and cellular biology department here. And he taught this class called Artificial and Natural Intelligence and asked me to help him design and teach it with him. So I ended up doing so for 3 years. And here's a funny picture of when I actually taught this section over Zoom. On the last day, they decided to all show up as me, which I thought was very cute. And some of my students, maybe not from that class, but some of my students are actually here today, so it's very heartwarming. I also want to thank Tari Tan, who is an educator. She's the Dean of Educational Innovation at HMS, but she really helped me develop as an educator in teaching pedagogical strategies to become a better teacher and mentor. And with her, I participated in this program where we went to Atlanta and taught at HBCUs. And then John Assad, who's our program director, but also he was very supportive. And whenever I came to him and I told him I wanted to create a new course for our graduate program called Math Tools for Neuroscience, and he backed me up with all the paperwork and everything and made it happen. So that was very rewarding. I want to thank all the people that I've had the privilege of mentoring. So in particular, I want to highlight Anne Huang, who's here over there in the back. And she's really, the best and the most star undergraduate student that you could ask for. And in fact, she's now a first-year student here in the Harvard PIN program, which is really cool. This is when we met for the first time in person. And then I've mentored some other undergraduates that have given me the privilege of becoming a better mentor. Of course, I want to thank my lab. I'm just, it's just so fun when you can go work with a bunch of really bright and quirky people in the lab. Yang, one of our lab members, we always talk about how everyone in the lab is weird in their own way, and that's why it makes every day fun and interesting. So thank you for all the feedback and ideas that have circulated amongst us. I want to thank the broader community of friends that I've made through cognitive science at MIT and Harvard. There's been a lot of fun philosophical discussions at parties, and sometimes I go, spinning with my friends. So that's me dragging them to the bike studio. I want to thank my classmates, my wonderful cohort of friends who I think all by groupthink, we all decided to come here together. It was a collective decision. And it's been really fun ever since. We've had the privilege of seeing each other grow up as scientists and as people over the last 6 years, and it's been really meaningful. I want to thank Quincy House, which is the residential college that I was an RA, or they call them tutors here at, for 2 years. And through that, I met a lot of wonderful students and other fellow tutors who I became really good friends with. And here's me hosting some study breaks for my students. This is us having a party in my apartment. I want to thank my the only roommates that I've had here in my time at Harvard. We lived at this place called 2 Inman, and our group chat is called Nobel Prize 2050 because we're aspirational like that. But if anyone were to win the Nobel Prize, my guess is that it would be Daniel. So here's 2 Inman in Portugal, 2 Inman on a boat, and 2 Inman at 2 Inman. Of course, I have amazing friends from over the years that I'm just so lucky to, they support me even though they don't really know what I do. And they always ask me, like, how's your PhD going? What are you studying? Like, when are you graduating? And, finally I'll be able to tell them that I did. my friends in Okinawa that I've made in the last year that have been really supportive. And again, this applies to all the pictures. If your picture is not here, it doesn't mean that I didn't think of you. It just means that I couldn't find you in my Google Photos. But yeah, it's been wonderful. They've been so supportive as I've been writing my thesis from Japan and providing me a lot of company. I want to thank my spiritual community at Trinity Cambridge Church. I realize I don't even have a picture with you, Sean. So here's a picture of you preaching the word. But yeah, I'm thankful that it's important to have other aspects of your life that help you become centered as a person. And my faith has really been that for me. And of course, I thank God for designing such a beautiful thing as the brain that is so worthy of study. Finally, I want to thank my family and my extended family as well, through Ethan. In particular, my parents who sacrificed a lot to give me opportunities that they never had. And unfortunately, my parents couldn't be here today because my mom is actually undergoing treatment for her breast cancer, but she really inspires me and is a source of strength in my life. So thank you, Mom. And of course, last but not least, I want to thank my husband, Ethan, who has just been so wonderfully supportive over the last however many years we've been together and friends. And we got married last year and then immediately moved to Japan, as some of you know. And it's just been so fun getting to explore the world with you. And one thing that, again, I think really was just a true picture of in sickness and in health was when all the times in the last few months that Ethan took me to the hospital and took care of me and even dressed me and made sure that I was able to even stand here today. So thank you so much. So yeah, now you can ask questions.